The attitudes and fighting spirit of the Anzacs appears to have always been strong. So where was the Gallipoli campaign lost?
Oh, probably right at the start. Even before that, honestly, because we probably had about half as many men as we needed. The original naval attacks were completely botched by both the British and the French. So, and it was appallingly badly planned. And on top of that, the reconnaissance was so badly done, they didn't even have decent maps, which is becoming more and more evident as specialists in surveying and GIS and so on are looking at these things. They literally got lost because they didn't know where they were half the time. And then, of course, at the key moment of Chunuk Bair, the whole thing wasn't coordinated well enough. The Australians shouldn't really have been at Lone Pine. They should have been probably coming in behind the New Zealanders up Chunuk Bair. And then the British kind of arrived a bit late, so it wasn't coordinated at all well. So there's key moments like that, but I think it was more or less doomed from the start.
I think it was probably quite a challenge to achieve a successful campaign, given the fact the Turks had been warned about attacks on the Dardanelles since late 1914. I mean, by the time the troops land in April 1915, had been a couple of naval assaults on the Narrows, February and March, and the battle plans had been reasonably well advertised from Egypt. I mean, the Turks again weren't silly. They knew the Allies were coming. They had a pretty good idea of where they were going to land. I just think in some ways it needed more of an aggressive British command structure to achieve the results.
The Gallipoli campaign actually began as a naval battle. The British wanted to go through the straits. They couldn't because there were guns on either side. They tried taking them out by shelling, they tried taking them out with raiding parties, but the Turks kept firing, they couldn't get through. And one of the great heroes on the Turkish side is this guy, Corporal Sayat, who lifted shells of an incredible weight to keep his gun firing after the gun carriage had broken. He's remembered as one of the great heroes of the Turkish defence of the Dardanelles in 1915.
All of Gallipoli was supposed to be a joint operation, a joint forces operation, so it was going to be an army landing supported by the navy. There was supposed to be a third naval push up through the Narrows to again distract the Turks from what was happening on the ground. That never happened. If the British had been more effective, had the Turks been ordered to send their troops down to Cape Helles to meet that threat and take the pressure away from Anzac Cove, and had the Australians and the New Zealanders had even a few more hours to get to the heights and try and develop the strong points they needed to develop, who knows?
The troops were evacuated from Gallipoli just before Christmas 1915. But the terrible conditions that they'd experienced over their 9 months on the peninsula had destroyed the proud force of fit young men who left Dunedin with such high hopes in August 1914. Those few who survived were gaunt, skeletal wrecks.
To think what the life was like in the trenches, and that sort of unremitting grind and drudgery of it all, mixed up with danger. You know, I can't believe what it was those men managed to put up with for so long and still be battle effective at the end of it. It's incredible. It's the heat, it's the dust, it's the dysentery, it's the lice, it's the general conditions of being in the front line. And there's not a moment's peace for a soldier either. If you're not on sentry duty, you're on garrison duty. You're waiting to be called up to be in the front line. And if you're not doing that, you're in the back line digging trenches, pulling equipment up. Come November, the temperature drops. You're coming into the Turkish winter, so everything changes. The climate changes. There's hail, there's rain, there's a snowstorm that blankets the whole peninsula in snow for a day or two.
As well as battling the Turks and the terrible living conditions, the soldiers had to put up with substandard equipment and provisions. Keeping the army supplied from far off Egypt for 9 months was a huge logistical challenge.
I think the food was substandard for the first month or so. It caught up and it was adequate for a lot of the rest of the campaign. When a medical officer went and inspected the frontline troops later in the campaign, he was looking for scurvy, but he could see that the health of the troops was good enough, but what was really killing them was dysentery. That was ripping through them. Now, as to the clothing, again, we equipped a territorial force that was going to go to France. As far as we knew, we were equipping our soldiers for service in a cold climate. As to whether that was adequate for Gallipoli, well, clearly, who would want to land in a heavy woolen suit in the Middle East in April heading into summer? You know, it's not suitable. Probably the most suitable item of equipment was the headgear. That kept the sun off, and that's the best you could expect in that climate. As for the weaponry and equipment, it galls me that our troops were given second-hand rifles. It also annoys the heck out of me that their ammunition supplies carried in paper packets of tins tied with string. You're expecting our troops to go in the front line, face massed attacks of Turks, and you haven't got the latest breech-loading rifle. You've got something that has a slow rate of fire, and that hinders your military effectiveness. I mean, our government, by doing things on the cheap, helped hamstring our soldiers' performance at Gallipoli.
Nine out of every 10 soldiers who survived Gallipoli had been wounded or become seriously ill during the campaign. Such troops were evacuated either to the Greek island of Lemnos or else sent directly back to Egypt. Medical support on the peninsula was poor and disorganised.
The medical facilities initially from Gallipoli were terrible. There were not enough medical personnel either on or close to Gallipoli, not enough ships to evacuate the wounded, not enough medical facilities in Cairo, not enough ships to bring wounded guys home.
But the medical conditions early on were terrible. No one in the Australian, the New Zealand, the British forces had contemplated the sheer number of casualties that would happen. So there were efficient ways of getting the men from the front line back down to the beaches at Gallipoli. The field hospitals there, the field ambulances rather, did their damnedest to try and stabilise people, treat the wounds, get them ready for further medical treatment. Where things fell over was then getting the men from the beach to the ships, and from the ships back to the hospitals back in Egypt, Alexandria. And that's where the worst fatalities happened. You know, men who could have been saved died on the voyage back to a hospital. And to me, the worst conditions were on those ships travelling from Anzac Cove back to Egypt, where men were just left lying out on the open decks on ships in the blazing sun. And they just got sicker and sicker and sicker and faded away.
Gallipoli was a genuinely torrid experience for the Anzacs. They knew little about their opponents, the Turks. How did they view these exotic foes from the other side of the world?
They sort of treated them with contempt at first, but once they fought against them, they realised that they were human beings the same as them, that they were good, tough, brave soldiers, and a mutual respect developed fairly quickly that you know persists to the present.
For the Turks, defending their homeland, we were the invaders, we were the baddies. So the attitude that they've taken back then and right through the present, the attitude of reconciliation, the attitude of accepting our lost sons here as part of their soil is quite amazing. And this speech made by Kemal, the outstanding military leader here at Gallipoli in 1915, who later went on to become the founder of modern Turkey, the father of the nation. In 1934 he made this amazing speech accepting responsibility for the sons of New Zealand and Australia and other countries who were buried here at Gallipoli and promising to look after them. It's just very moving. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. You might wonder what the Turks thought when they discovered that the people that were fighting them on Anzac were Australians and New Zealanders, places they'd probably never heard of, and actually they were gobsmacked. And when they asked the New Zealanders and Australians they came into contact with, why are you coming to fight here? The answer really wasn't that good, because they really didn't know what they were doing here either, I suppose. Yet at the end of the campaign, both sides had developed an enormous amount of respect for the tenacity and the courage of those that they were fighting against. And in retrospect, that continues. If you look at this extraordinary statue in the centre here of Ecbat, the combatants of all nations are depicted on it. But on the left-hand side, you can see the wounded New Zealander with the Turk's arm around him and reaching up, imploring to God for mercy. And I think that's quite an extraordinary depiction of the attitude between the combatants at the end of the struggle. Thousands of New Zealand lives were lost to Gallipoli, and many more effectively destroyed. Who was to blame for this catastrophe?
I still have no problem pointing the finger at Winston Churchill and saying, well, you had the idea, you had the vision, you just didn't push it hard enough to get the resources needed to pull this thing off. A bright idea is one thing, but if you're going to make it happen, you actually have to commit everything to make it happen.
I don't think politicians in Britain realised how difficult the terrain was on the peninsula, how determined the Turks would be. I don't think the British at the time in late 1914 had the organisational skill to get an army there properly equipped in time. There's a whole range of factors, and what's most noticeable to me about Gallipoli was that the evacuation of it was near perfect, whereas the landing on Gallipoli on April the 25th and 6th, 1915 was a disaster, which indicates to me that when they could properly plan something, they could actually do it quite well. And if the landing had half the planning that the evacuation did, it may not have been a failure at all.
The real fault lay in High British Command, and it just wasn't thought through properly, and it wasn't planned anywhere near well enough. There weren't enough resources, there wasn't enough ammunition, there wasn't enough equipment, and certainly there was nowhere near enough men. So it all goes back to the pre-planning or lack of it, really.
And some of the other commanders, I mean, I look at Hunter Weston down at Cape Helles. Where did they get him from? I mean, honestly. I look at General Stopford with the Suvla Bay landings, just terrible. I look at our own General Godley, who comes under severe criticism for much of his military command during World War I, rightly so.
But it wasn't just Godley. The whole High Command dithered and didn't seem that good at planning, and was so obsessed with secrecy that no one really knew what anyone else was doing.
In Napoleonic times, you had murderers and killers in terms of your commanders. I think your murderers intentionally put troops in the front line, your killers just do it negligently. I think some of our commanders were murderers. I think the one regret the New Zealanders had was leaving their mates behind. The buried, the missing. There was a lot of unresolved grief associated with Gallipoli.